Hi again, everybody. I'm Edgar Jati, Executive Director of Workplace Fairness, and I'm joined today by Janae Cargill, who is a DEI manager for a global finance company. And we're going to talk about DEI, which has been a hot button topic if you've been following the news. Recently, the federal government has rolled back a lot of DEI efforts in the federal government, which has also um, had many negative effects, we would say, across the business community across the country. And today we're going to talk about what that means in terms of belonging in workplaces, but also um, situations where businesses are actually doubling down on the DI efforts, what that's looking like currently. And so, Janae, I want you to introduce yourself a little bit more, and then we'll get started.
Hi everyone, my name is Janae Hill Cargill, and I am a global DEI manager in the equipment finance industry. Um, Happy to be here today and answer a few of Edgar's questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Janae.
Mhm.
And so, to get started, why do you believe it's crucial for organizations to uphold and even strengthen DEI and belonging policies despite shifting political landscapes?
Well, I think it's first important to understand that DEI isn't just a political issue, it's about business strategy survival or business survival strategy, right? Companies that treat it as a long term investment are going to be the companies that are going to stay ahead of this, right? So to answer your question more pointedly, organizations that scale back on DEI efforts in response to political shifts, they're making a very short-sighted decision,
Mhm.
right? And the reality is workforce demographics, global markets, business risk, they aren't changing based upon politics, right?
Right.
They're changing and they're actually evolving. They're not
Yeah.
changing, they're
Right.
evolving,
Right.
right? Based upon economic and societal trends. And then when you think about the economic advantage, right? Companies with diverse leadership outperform their competitors by 35%. So that's not about an ideology, that's about profitability. When you think about legal and compliance risk, while federal government may be rolling back on DEI initiatives, many states, courts, and international markets are actually reinforcing them.
Hmm.
And then lastly, when it comes to talent and workforce expectations, the next generation of talent is demanding more inclusivity and equity. When you think about the workforce today, numbers show that in 2025, now 75% of the workforce is going to be comprised of millennials and Gen Zs. Um,
Hmm.
and then, sorry, I'm getting messages coming in. I probably should have silenced them. And then
It's okay.
additionally, um, by I believe it's 2030, one in five employees will be of immigrant background.
Hmm.
So the shift is constantly evolving, right? You have the baby boomers who are going to be leaving the organization, and
Right.
we have to be mindful about the talent that we're looking to attract, retain, and grow that are going to be the next leaders. So that would be my answer. So I think like the bottom line here is that it's not about politics. It's about long-term sustainability, compliance, and having a competitive advantage as an organization. So the best companies are adapting. They're not reacting or retreating.
Hmm. No, that's a great response, Janae. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that DEI is really about um, enhancing your organization, not necessarily um, trying to be part of one ideology or another. But you raise an interesting point about data points, right? And looking at the data points around the benefits of DEI and how it can enhance your organization. So, what is your advice to organizations that are waffling? They're not sure what to do. How would you best guide them to make a final decision, which may support keeping or even doubling down on the DEI efforts?
Um, that was I don't think that was, but I will say, companies that are waffling and they don't want to, they're afraid to double down on the DE&I efforts. I think it's about framing, right?
Hmm.
It really boils down to how you're looking at business. It's about having a strategic planning around your workforce? What do you want your
Hmm.
workforce to look like? What's happening in the shifts? And the fact of the matter is, we're going to continue to do this work, whether you call it DE&I or not. You
Right.
know, 50 years ago, we were doing this work and it wasn't called DE&I. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to the wording. For companies that do want to get in this and are kind of teetering between, start to forecast what talent's looking for, right?
Right. Right.
Um, Start there. Where do you want your company to be in the next 30, 40, 50 years? Do you want them to be an employer of choice, an employer that
Hmm.
attracts, retain, and grows top talent? Do you want this company to be competitive? Do you want them to be resilient? When you think about your wants, what you want your output to be, then you can start to work backwards
Right.
into it, right? So for companies that are waffling, just I would put aside the ideology of DE&I and focus on strategic workforce planning. And that's the new name for DE&I in my mind.
Yeah. Thank you for
So,
that, Janae.
yeah, sure.
So, how is your organization navigating these changes, and what strategies have you found effective in maintaining a commitment to inclusivity?
Sure. So I would say like the smartest organizations, they're reframing DE&I as a business, as a part of the business strategy, more like a business imperative, right? Not just the HR initiative. And that's like one thing that I'm really focused on myself, right?
Hmm.
Because if you frame it as an HR initiative, then it will remain in HR. So
Right.
you have
Right.
to frame it as a business imperative and show that it needs, that it has importance in every space of the business, right? So whether it's risk mitigation, right? By hiring diverse talent allows you to identify blind spots earlier, which allows you to mitigate risk, whether they're legal,
Right.
reputational, compliance, right? Um, so I would say the three key strategies for working effectively are one, aligning DE&I with business risk and compliance
Hmm.
instead of leaning with, and this is something that I think is extremely important. And stop saying it's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing to do, it's the warm thing to do. Anybody who's been in this work understands that oftentimes DE&I is perceived as like arts and crafts, right? It's not, people don't see the value add. And
Yeah.
more importantly, depending on the organization, how success is defined in DEI, that changes per
Right.
organization, right?
Right.
So if you survey Fortune 500 companies and you ask them what the success look like, I'm sure they're probably all on the same page about numbers, profit, volume, right? When it comes to DE&I, right, it's a little bit different. And there is no one set way to determine what success is, right? So I think like for the key strategies, just to go back to your question, the key strategies is aligning it, right? Stop making it sound like it's a fun thing to do, but highlight how successful companies emphasize risk mitigation, workforce evolution to maintain that buy-in from leaderships, shifting from programs to business integration. We talked a little bit about that, right? So
Right.
you want to make sure you're embedding DE&I outside of HR, outside as a one-off initiative. So embedding it into your legal system so they can identify the regulations and compliance.
Right. Right.
Um, um, Embedding it into finance, into your marketing, not just into HR. Um, and then making sure that your work is data driven. Again, stay away from the feel good things, but you really
Hmm.
want to pull, you really want to tie in the data that supports it, right? There's plenty of information out there. McKinsey is a great go to, right? They've done a study on why DE&I matters, and I think it spans a course of like 5, 6 years or longer,
Hmm.
right? So
Right.
they're tracking this. So I would definitely use your resources and be able to provide that data. And the point is that companies that succeed aren't the loudest about DE&I. They're the most strategic about
Right.
DE&I.
Right. Right. So those are all wonderful points. And you mentioned something about compliance, and I know that for a lot of organizations and Americans, they are wondering, based off of a lot of what's happening at the federal level, if DEI is not illegal. And not that I'm asking you legal advice, but as a DEI practitioner, what would you tell people when they say, "Oh, isn't that illegal now? We shouldn't be doing that."
So I, I would say that um, it's not illegal. It's definitely not illegal, but there are certain things that, you know, could be, right? So if you're
Right,
tracking numbers and saying we need to hire this number of black women or black
right,
men, like that is illegal,
right,
right?
right.
So I think it's one, familiarize yourself with the law, make sure you have a strong legal team that you're consulting. Um, understand that when it comes to how you frame DE&I, that narrative, you need to be very mindful about that. Um, and a lot of times, resistance comes from people not understanding the relevance of
Hmm.
DE&I. So
Right,
it's really important to like meet the audience where they are, so you can kind of help debunk some of the things that they're thinking, such as DE&I is illegal.
right, right. Yeah, and no, thanks for sharing that, Janae. And what I would also add is that uh, to some degree, yes, the federal government is cracking down on DEI programs. It's being litigated in the courts right now. A federal court has blocked the administration from uh, uh, cutting federal spending that relates to DEI initiatives, and currently is not doing any enforcement based off of the executive order that President Trump had signed back in January. However, it doesn't change the rubric of federal and state laws that protect against discrimination, which is very important to remember when thinking about DEI, which, to Janae's point, also includes not using quotas or anything like that, to try to promote hiring of certain groups over others. So those things are still in place and are right now settled law when it comes to what agencies, whether it's state or local level, state or federal level, look for when determining if there's any discrimination in hiring or any D&I initiative that a company is employing is sound law. So I just want to make that clear to people that are wondering about, if I do a DEI program, if I see one, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not in compliance with the law.
Correct, correct. There are you do have state and local laws that do conflict a little bit, and then you're also seeing even global laws, right, where
Yeah,
they're still pushing that you do need to have inclusive hiring practices. We are still going to monitor, and so we're still going down that DE&I path. So you are finding this clash, right? You're even seeing when from private companies are bailing out or retracting from a DE&I standpoint, and then the consumer is now using their money to pull away from
right.
these private companies. You're also seeing lawsuits
Right,
coming out of
right,
companies that are being too aggressive in how they're pulling back, and now it's like catching them again, right? So they're pulling back and being aggressive and say we won't do anything, and now you're dealing with the lawsuits
right.
from whether it's shareholders, whether it's
Bad press.
consumers, employees. Correct.
Yeah.
So it is a fine line to walk. Again, I'm not a lawyer nor am I a politician, but
Famous
um,
words.
yes. But it is not illegal, but there are certain things that you do need to be mindful
Yeah,
of. And again, I strongly encourage you to lean in on your legal team, um, to stay abreast of what those regulations and directives and mandates are as they do come about.
yeah, yeah. No, thank you for that sage advice.
Of
And
course, of course.
you've mentioned a lot of different things that, in terms of strategy and what have you. And I'm glad to hear that your company is still continuing to use DEI as a way to do business. But from your perspective and what you're observing, what other things are you seeing organizations do, whether in your industry or beyond, who are similar to you, saying, "Look, we're going to still do this," but how are they also navigating the current, you know, political climate around DEI to ensure that they're still holding true to their missions?
Yeah, so I would say one, you see organizations responding in three different ways, right? You see some companies that are pulling back and they're scaling back due to legal and political pressures, right?
Right,
And these are companies who I believe are looking at it more as a compliance risk rather than a business imperative, right?
right, right,
So they're retreating to protect their brand. Others are adapting, so they're embedding DE&I even deeper into their business operations, right? So they recognize that equity and risk mitigation are core business success drivers, right?
right,
So they're integrating it into leadership accountability, financial risk assessments, workforce planning. So they're just driving it down deeper.
right,
And
right.
then the most forward thinking organizations, they're redefining DE&I as an innovation driver,
Okay.
right? So we talked a lot about strategic workforce planning,
Hmm.
right? So think of it more so about what do you want your organization to look like? How are they going to sustain themselves? What does innovation look like? Who are we attracting? How are we retaining that talent? Um, and instead of making DE&I about compliance and quotas, they're shifting more so to profits,
Right.
adaptability, and leadership excellence.
Nice, nice, nice.
So I will say, I am in the equipment finance industry, and there is a magazine called The Monitor, and The
Hmm.
Monitor just shared their latest edition on best companies in equipment finance. Um, and there's a section in there for DE&I, and there's several companies that have been highlighted for their achievements and the work that they're doing in the space.
Right.
So for the equipment finance industry, not only are some companies still moving forward with it, but companies are still being recognized for it.
Yeah, that's refreshing to hear, and I think that should also be a positive reinforcement for people or organizations that are still looking to do this work, but again have felt a little nervous about it or outright scared, which is understandable.
Yeah,
But to look for models of, okay, what are other organizations doing
correct.
right now, or even in the past, right, to ensure that, if they want DEI to be a mission of theirs, that they're still doing it, and particularly in climates that are not necessarily um, we're supportive of that, and I would even echo that. I'm sure even before this administration that, if you're in certain states that have been, that's not
Yeah,
necessarily, hotbeds for DEI, positive DEI discourse. There's still companies that have survived in those types of environments, uh, and certainly, the larger, even larger companies that have already outwardly said we're going to double down on our DI initiatives, like
right.
Costco
Yep.
or Apple, right? So there are
Mhm.
models out there that you can look to see, like, what's being done and how they're doing successfully.
Agreed, agreed. And you see, it's funny because, diverse perspective is diverse dollars when you think about the profits, right? You see that
Right,
you if you just pull up NASDAQ, right, and just look, you'll see the backlash of you see the correlation between companies
right,
that are pulling out and their stocks that are going down versus companies that are reaffirming
right.
versus their stocks that are going up, right? And the reality is, and the numbers might be a little bit different now,
Hmm.
um, but the reality is it sounds louder than what it is.
Right,
Um,
right.
so I want to say it was about a month ago. We'll have to double check it. You might have to fact check me later on, but out of the Fortune 500 companies, 485 of them are still invested in DE&I. And what happens is when you make a declaration to come out of it, right? To say I'm
Right,
no longer going to do this, that sounds a lot louder. But the reality is most companies are just steadily, silently,
right,
they're moving forward. They're not coming out and saying, well, just because Eggert pulled out, I'm going to still be. They're not
right,
doing that.
right,
They're
right.
continuing to just do the work, right?
Yeah,
So it sounds louder than what it is. It is still very alarming. Don't get me
right.
wrong there. It is
Yeah,
still very alarming. However, there are a lot of more companies that are still committed to DE&I than companies that are not.
yeah, yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And we talked a lot about how to maintain it, and despite facing any challenges or pushback. But can you talk about any challenges you have faced, in trying to continue doing this work? I mean, I mean, we've talked about the obvious challenges,
Yeah.
which hence why we're doing this recording. But it'd be good to hear from you. Like, have you faced any pushback or resistance, whether uh, internal or externally, in the work you're doing with for your company?
Yeah, I will say not necessarily pushback, but I would say language shift was a big thing because of everything that's happening in the political scene right now.
Hmm.
So instead of saying DEI is about fairness, it's good to say a diverse leadership team mitigates financial and
Right.
reputational risk. Inclusive hiring expands access to untapped markets. So learning to shift your language, um, which is fine
Yeah.
because to your point, there's always been a measure of resistance to DEI,
Hmm.
whether you're working with a location or a business that doesn't understand the value of it. It goes back to the point that I made earlier. A lot of resistance comes from the perception of irrelevance, right?
Right.
So when you don't see the value in it, then it's hard for someone to actually support it, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's with anything. So that takes me to my next point. It's just really meeting the skeptics where they are, right? So trying to find that common ground and understand, where what matters to them. So if leadership cares about profitability, then show them McKinsey's report on how diverse companies outperform their competitors, right?
Right.
If it's
Right.
about risk management, then highlight legal and compliance concerns and how diverse perspectives cater to blind spots
Hmm.
from and how that mitigates risk. So I would look at it more so for meeting the leaders or business or whomever your audience where they are. So and I think as DEI professionals we do try to be very intentional about understanding our audience and trying to meet them where they are before we
Right.
start moving off in several different directions. So listening, asking questions, and listening with intent. Don't just get in there and start talking
Right.
about
Right.
DEI. Um, and then lastly, just embedding it into the operations. I think that's a common
Hmm.
challenge, right? Oftentimes DEI is seen as HR, right? So then it's an HR initiative, and then
Right. Right.
anyone in HR works with it, but you do have to take it a step further than that. That way you're embedding it into the business, right? So whether it's leadership performance, whether it's performance management
Hmm.
systems, leadership decision making frameworks, workforce planning and risk assessments, these are things that take it from just being in HR to starting to embed it
Right.
in a business.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I think I hope I answered that.
No, no, that was perfect,
Okay.
and it seems to me to kind of try to bring a lot of these like great advice home. It's really about being measured and being data driven, and not um, succumbing too much to all the noise that's happening. Right? Because there'll always gonna be naysayers, right? But
Of
it
course.
seems to me a lot of those naysayers, at least when you really break it down right now, it seems as if they're winning. But when you really break it down, DEI is pretty much a fully embedded business operation for many
Mhm.
organizations, and which has evolved over time, right? And it's all about being measured in your approach and being well researched and data driven. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Because I think traditionally, when you think about DEI, it immediately connects to feelings, how you
Hmm.
feel, and not to dismiss that, right? Coming
Right.
into work and being at a place where you feel respected and valued and seen is critical, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that ties to engagement. Engagement ties to production and progression and retention,
Right.
and
Right.
so all of it is connecting, right? So um, we have to move away from just the feels of it when you're able to track the data and
Hmm.
show like what happens when we lose talent, right? How
Right.
long is that role empty? What knowledge have we lost? How long does it take? What type of resources, whether it's time, money that's going in to fill that role, right? Um, we're losing talent when we're not able to create a safe and respectful place for them to work,
Right.
right? And that impacts productivity, that impacts innovation. So being able to have a clearer understand, making sure that the direction that you're leading them is supported and backed by data.
Right.
There's a lot of data out here, whether it's Gallup, Gartner, McKinsey. Um, there's several others that you can go to that shows you exactly what DE&I does for an organization. So yes, always have the data. I will say, again, not a lawyer, but I would definitely stay away from like goal setting, right?
Hmm.
Speak more about like what your ambition is.
Hmm.
That's one thing that we have been leaning on. I know in my
Yeah,
organization is
that's
more
good
so
advice.
focusing on, our ambition is to do this. And that way you can kind of get away from that red tape of, legal
Right. Right.
repercussions should that ever occur. So I would definitely say, use the data that's out there to back there's tons of studies. um, it's really important to understand where your organization sits in terms of its backgrounds, its demographics. So understanding that will only help you better plan for your future
Yeah.
workforce, right? um, it is important to know how much of your organization is going to be retiring within the next 5 years.
Right. Right. Right.
Where are those critical roles, right? So where in your organization do you have only one Edgar who has been doing this job and only he knows it, and there's no succession plan? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
You got to start looking at it from a data standpoint, understanding this is the talent we have, this is the talent we may not have, this is the talent we're going to need, this is the talent that will be coming in.
Right.
You start looking at it from a number standpoint, and looking at what your organization needs in terms of growth. um, it
Yeah.
makes the case a lot stronger.
Yeah, and also where you find the talent too, right? And expanding your
Mhm.
reach in terms of where you find the talent, and something I
Correct.
always tell people is, your next hire can look like anybody, right? As long as they meet, the things you're looking for,
Yeah.
they can look like anybody, so you have to be
Yeah.
open to that prospect because you might miss out on your best hire if you're
Mhm.
so tunnel visioned about what the person should look like, right? They can
Yeah.
look like anybody.
Yeah. And I think there's this interesting thing about when it comes to recruitment is that oftentimes, and I've been a people leader before, where oftentimes, you're just looking to fill the next role.
Right.
Someone's left the organization for whatever reasons, voluntary or involuntary, and now you have a role that you need to have filled, and you want to have it filled by X date.
Right.
Oftentimes, leaders are working with the candidate slate that they were given. They're not necessarily challenging that.
Hmm.
So, and maybe we'll address this question a little bit later when we talk about controlling, about like advice. So I'm gonna just jump into it. So like my advice for people who don't necessarily have DEI embedded in our organization,
Hmm.
maybe leadership's not on board. Control what you can, right?
Right.
So if you're a hiring manager and you want to have a more well-rounded candidate slate, then push back.
Hmm.
Ask
That's good.
your talent acquisition team, hey, this is great, but can we make sure that it's a little bit more all-encompassing? It looks like I'm only getting one type of a candidate or only two types of candidate, and that also links directly to you understanding your team, though, right?
Hmm.
As a leader, you need to
Right.
understand your team. Where are your weak spots, and understand what do you need in your team. um, but control what you can, kind of push back in the hiring panels. I'm sorry, I lost my thought, but
That's okay.
yeah, I guess I'll stop there unless it comes back to me.
Yeah.
But we
No.
were talking about
Yeah.
talent sourcing. So definitely be a little bit more mindful and understand that you do have influence
Hmm.
um, on the talent that gets to come in.
Yeah. That's a great question, and really we're getting at the last question of giving advice to employees on how to bring DEI to the workplaces, particularly in environments where it may not be supported by leadership. And I think Janae um, made some great advice about, or giving some great advice about controlling what you can, right?
Yeah.
And making changes or making suggestions where it might be maybe even small ones, but it can go a
Mhm.
long way into creating an environment where people feel more welcomed and seen. So, and also how and also influencing how a organization does business, externally. So I think it's always good to have a plan, know what be aware of your work environment. So read the room. I think it's always important to do that, but control when you can, and slowly but surely making small changes, because when you think about whether it's our country's history or organizations at the micro level, it's not always the big changes that make the big difference. To me, if anything, it's a manifestation of all the small changes in
Correct.
conversations and things that are done, to get to that big change. So just keep that in mind.
Absolutely. I'm just going to kind of piggyback on that
Yeah.
a little bit. There's plenty of little things that you can do. We talked about the interviewing panel, be a
Hmm.
little bit more inclusive by pushing back a little bit. Also, when you're looking for talent, you could train
Hmm.
anybody,
Yeah.
and in the first 90 days, you can get them caught up, and the reality is especially like if your industry is reflective of the majority of one certain demographic and you're looking for more diversity, this is the thought I wanted to say. So it's really important to kind of focus on those soft skills, the
Hmm.
skills based versus I need someone who has 15 years of equipment finance experience who went to this school. Well, then you're almost carving yourself to have
Right.
one certain look or two certain looks of a candidate, when in reality, you can bring someone into the organization who has 15 years of equipment finance experience and they are horrible at their job.
Right. Right.
like,
Right.
like that sometimes that doesn't really, for some roles, I understand you may need a certain type of skill.
Hmm.
Um, and you may need that today and not, in the next 6 months. But every role doesn't require that, right?
Right.
So
Right.
understand what you want the output to be, right? Do you want someone who's good at making decisions in the gray? Someone
Hmm.
who's really good at negotiating with our third party contracts and having difficult discussions. Someone who's
Right.
detail oriented. Think about that, right? And
Yeah.
then when you start to interview, ask your questions, tell it around what does success look like in this role? Someone who's able to embody these things,
Hmm.
not someone who's able to hit 100 widgets, but
Right.
someone that's really good
Yeah.
at, you know, getting to someone on the same page, everybody on the same page towards a common goal. Those are the things that you really should be looking for, in terms of that. And then even in a workplace setting outside of recruitment, whether you're a leader, you're not a leader, and you're in a room, a great way to make sure everybody, you're creating an inclusive culture is making sure everybody's voice is heard. If I
Hmm.
notice Edgar hasn't spoken up and I could see on his face like he probably has a thought, there's nothing wrong, especially if you have the loudest voice and saying, "Hey guys, I really want to make sure we hear everyone at the table. Edgar, did you have any thoughts?" And
Hmm.
lead in with one of the people who tend to be the most quiet or reserved
Right.
person, and let them open it up before the louder voices tend to drown it out.
Yeah.
Um, support the voice of an idea
Right.
that of
Right.
someone who isn't always speaking up. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I would have, and we probably have to end soon, but I would
Yeah.
even add to that. But when you do that, also being uh, open to what that person might have to say, right? Because
Correct.
you may not agree with what that person says, but the important thing is you have to give space to that, and work
Correct.
on how do you take the different opinions, right, and coming up with, a one solution. So I think that's really important. That's just leadership in general.
Yeah, yeah. And you'll see oftentimes in leadership, you'll see leaders will have their team, they'll bring the team together and they'll ask everybody for their opinions, but then they always navigate to their number one and number two
Exactly.
go-to
Exactly.
people.
Right.
And then everybody feels like, well, then why did you ask me?
Right.
Right. So I think it's also important. to be mindful as a leader. You know, we're all guilty of it because you trust your go-tos to
Right.
deliver a certain level, but also check yourself and say, okay, how many times did I run with Janae's ideas and didn't give Edgar an opportunity to just see if he can hit it out the park?
Right.
So I'll end on this because I know we're pressed for
Yeah.
time. This isn't about politics.
Yeah.
It's about whether businesses want to stay competitive.
Hmm.
The companies that embed DE&I into leadership, operations, and workforce strategy aren't surviving. They are setting the new standard for success.
Well, on that note, Janae, that was awesome. And thank you so much for your time today. And just for everyone listening and viewing this video, um, Workplace Fair has more resources about DEI and employment laws in general. So I would definitely encourage you all to visit our know your rights content where you can get more information about what is legal, what's not legal, and just further educate yourself on DEI and what it means to create belonging in the workplace. So thank you all for being with us today, and talk to you all soon. Take care, everybody.